Alrighty, so French and Indian War. If somebody just told me, hey, we're going to talk about the French and Indian War, and I knew nothing about it, my first instinct would be that this was a war between the French and the Indian. But that is not exactly accurate. That is not entirely true, but we will find that out here in just a bit, okay? So to understand the French and Indian War, we have to understand some background. Particularly, the number one background to get is that Great Britain and France hate each other. These are not just frenemies, they are straight up enemies. They do not like each other, okay? And they are serious rivals for a couple of different reasons. One is that they both have territory, colonies that they control in North America. And they're both using mercantilism to expand their colonial claims and increase their wealth. So they're very much in direct competition with one another. That is the big issue here. They are very much in direct competition with one another. And Great Britain and France are going to go to war 3 times in Europe, just from 1690 to 1750. And any time you have a war between these two nations in Europe, that's going to boil over into the colonies as well. So any kind of war in Europe between the two is going to mean conflict in the colonies and between these colonists as well. During the 1700s, both Great Britain and France were expanding their colonies in North America. And this is truly where the French and Indian War conflict comes about. It is from this disputed territory in the Ohio River Valley. So land disputes along the Ohio River Valley lead to the French and Indian War. And the reason why that is because the British colonies are kind of growing out of space, or they need more space. So the only way to go is west, unless you plan to live in the Atlantic Ocean like your Aquaman. The only way to move is west. And that means butting up and into French-controlled territory. The Ohio River Valley is also very profitable and useful for both of these countries. If you're a French colonist, you are engaged in fur trading in the North American colonies, so the Ohio River is important to you for that. And if you are, say, a plantation owner in the South, the Ohio River Valley, the valley itself is fertile land and can be useful to you in terms of agriculture. So this right here, this is the start of the French and Indian War conflict. And the very important and interesting thing to note is that the French and Indian War is the start of the American Revolution. Okay, the problems that arise out of this conflict between the British colonies and Great Britain are going to put us on the path to revolution. And so not only is the growth of these colonies impacting those individual European countries and their colonists, but the growth of these colonies are also going to impact Native Americans too, because there's Native Americans living all up in this place, okay? So what will happen is that the French are going to actually increase their alliance with Native Americans along the Ohio River Valley. They will increase their friendship and their business relationship and their trading relationship with Native Americans. And where the French are increasing their alliance with Native Americans, the British are just increasing their conflict with Native Americans. They are spreading out into the backcountry across the Appalachian Mountains, which is a very important geographical mark here. They are spreading across the Appalachian Mountains, and they are moving into territory controlled and occupied and lived on by Native Americans. So that is obviously going to increase conflict. The more contact between the two, the more conflict between the two groups. Right? So in 1754, on the eve of the French and Indian War, British colonists are going to get together, and they're going to meet at what they call Albany Congress. They meet at the Albany Congress to discuss that very common problem that all of the colonists have, which is Native American attacks. And Benjamin Franklin steps forward and he proposes something called the Albany Plan of Union. And he wants to get a coordinated colonial army together. He says, hey, if we can unify, if we can have a colonial army that will, help out every single one of the colonies here, then I think that we could probably handle these Native American attacks and that we could deal with our problems here. Unfortunately, have to remember that the colonial regions are all incredibly different and that those differences prevent them from unifying. So the Albany Plan is not approved, it fails. And the colonists definitely lack unity to solve this common problem amongst them, between them. This is the year and the space in which you get the first political cartoon as well. And that is this Join or Die political cartoon. So this is actually one of the documents offered to you in your interactive notebook for your hippos. So I'm going to actually help you guys out here a little bit, and we're going to do a very brief doc analysis of this particular political cartoon. So what is one of the first things that you notice about this political cartoon? You can just put it in the chat. What's something that you see here?
Each part of the snake is labeled with a different colony.
Yeah, absolutely. Right? So you have this snake and each one is labeled with the different colonies. And it's all cut up, right? It's all divided. And then you have that message, join or die. The message being that if a snake was all cut up just like this, right, it's probably not going to survive. This is probably a dead snake. But if he were unified, if he were not cut up like that, he would be a force to be reckoned with, right? And a live snake is probably something you don't want to encounter too often. So looking at this document, I'm going to do a very quick, I'm just going to do a hip. I'm not going to do a hippo, but I'm going to do a hip analysis for you. So the first part of our analysis is historical context, and I'm going to actually put this in the chat as I analyze it for you. So historical context here, we're talking about the Albany Congress. And that's where this political cartoon comes out of. That's what's happening at the time around this political cartoon. Albany Congress, Benjamin Franklin's Albany Plan of Union. Oops. Union, right? Nowhere in there do I even think about writing the year. The year is 1754, but we're talking about context setting, okay? Intended audience, who is it for? Our colonies, particularly our colonists, right? We want to encourage them to unify, okay? So your purpose of this political cartoon, unity. We need to get everybody on the same page, right? Encourage the colonies to unify as one rather than to think about themselves as independent individual colonies, right? And then POV, that's got to be from Benjamin Franklin. So think about where he might be coming from. What is his point of view? He's probably frustrated that the Albany Plan isn't successful. He wants to see our problems be solved here, right? He wants to see a commonality amongst our colonies, right? So that's a really very, very quick hip. If I were you, I'd grab that from the chat, I'd put it in a doc and make sure I have it and save it, and then you can even use that for your interactive notebook, right? Expand on it, obviously, but you can use that, okay? It's a very quick hip on this political cartoon. In 1754, this year that you have for the Albany Congress and the Join or Die cartoon and Benjamin Franklin's failed Albany Plan of Union becomes a turning point, right? There are years in history that are important and we just label them turning points. Something big happens here, right? There is a shift in what we're talking about. And for the U.S. in its early years as baby colonies, 1754 is important. And this is going to mark the beginning of the French and Indian War. The Virginia governor is going to send a very young, spry 22-year-old George Washington to protect an Ohio company claim. This is one of his first, what do you call it? Oh, I'm having a brain fart. Leadership roles, right? His first command in as a soldier here, and his troops are actually forced to retreat from Fort Duquesne. So think about this: this guy who has this large folklore in American history, George Washington, his first command is retreat. It's a failure, right? And this clash right here is the beginning of the French and Indian War. So the French and Indian War starts 1754 and it ends in 1763. And like I mentioned, if you told me the title of this war and I didn't know anything, I would think that this was a war between the French and the Native Americans. But it's broader than that, right? It's actually a war between Great Britain and her colonists over in North America and versus France, her colonists, and their Indian allies in North America. So you have to remember that this war is actually kind of being fought on two fronts. It's being fought here in North America between the British colonists, the French colonists, and the Native Americans. And it is also actually being fought in Europe as well. In Europe, this war has a very different name. It is called the 7 Years' War, right? So all you have to know for our purposes is French and Indian War, but just keep in mind that it is also being fought between France and Great Britain on their end as well. And in Europe, it is called the 7 Years' War, right? French and Indian War in North America, 7 Years' War in Great Britain, or Europe in general. So how does this war play out, right? Great Britain is losing in the early years of the war. They are not doing well. And the reason why they're not doing well is because of their incredibly ungrateful colonists, right? The colonists are looking at this and they're like, that sounds like a personal problem, right? They say French and Indian War, not really my cup of tea. I don't got to worry about that. That's a European conflict. It's nothing to do with me. And so they don't fight. They don't help fight as much as Great Britain expected. They certainly don't help raise taxes as much as Great Britain expected or as much as they needed. Y'all, it is incredibly, incredibly expensive to fight a war. It costs a lot of money. And the way that countries pay for wars and the way that countries just in general make money is through taxes, right? Taking raising taxes. So when it comes to the French and Indian War, the colonists are looking at this saying, not my problem. They're not fighting the way England would expect them to, and they're not raising taxes the way England would expect them to, and the way England needs them to. And this is problematic. This is where you start to see the fractures in the relationship between Great Britain and these North American colonists. In 1757, the Prime Minister of Great Britain says, you know what, we're going to do whatever it takes to win this war. He writes a, quote, blank check. I don't care how much it costs. I don't care what we have to do. We're going to win the war. Unfortunately, that is going to rack up some incredibly huge war debts for Great Britain. And it is Great Britain who looks to the colonists to expect them to pay off those war debts. Great Britain says, hey, we helped you, we helped you out here. We kind of fought this war for you, for this land in the Ohio River Valley. And you really didn't do anything. You didn't put much into it. You didn't raise taxes. And now we're in a lot of debt and it's time to pay up, man. Okay. Time to pay up. So like I mentioned, this is a brief war. We're going to talk about it briefly and we're done with the war. Okay. It officially ends in 1763 with the Treaty of Paris. But there's one thing that I want you to be incredibly, incredibly aware of. And that is that history just likes to confuse the students of history. And there are multiple Treaty of Parises. So it's so important to understand the year that the Treaty of Paris, the year that the French and Indian War ended, right? Treaty of Paris, 1763. I'm actually going to give you an acronym here in just a minute that will hopefully help you remember that year and all the things that go on in there. But before we do that, before we look at the terms of the treaty and who got what, et cetera, take a look at these two maps here. You have North America in 1754, and you have North America in 1763. All right. What's the number one thing that stands out to you? Number one difference between these two maps? Somebody tell me.
The pink.
Louisiana Purchase.
Right, so the pink is gone. So later it will be called the Louisiana Purchase. But what it means by not having the pink in 1763 is that France is no longer in here, right? They're no longer in the North American continent. They got a great big old butt whooping at the end of the French and Indian War. So when we look at the Treaty of Paris, 1763, and what Canada loses, what England gains, etc. Not Canada, sorry, France. France loses Canada, right? They also lose most of their empire in India, but that's irrelevant to us. And they also lose claims to lands that are east of the Mississippi River, right here, right? So this is the Mississippi River. East of the Mississippi River, they lose these lands, right? They lose Canada. A lot of stuff. England is going to gain all of those French lands in Canada. They're going to end up with territory here between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River that also belong to France. They're going to also gain exclusive rights to the Caribbean slave trade. And there's somebody else who gains a lot in this situation. Based on these maps, can you tell me who gained a lot in this situation, but we didn't ever talk about before?
Spanish.
The Spanish, right? Like, what the hell? What did they do? Where did they come from, right? The Spanish are a British ally. They actually helped them out in this conflict, so they got a little bit out of it too. They got all the lands west of the Mississippi River. They got New Orleans. However, they lost Florida to England. When we buy the Louisiana Purchase, we're going to buy it from France. So you're going to notice that Spain will lose this territory back to France later on. But that's for a future. Yes.
How did Russia get land?
So they
All the way
just
up in Canada.
they came over. So you got to remember, right, that this is the tip of Alaska, and then you have the Bering Strait. They just came over from Russia to Alaska. That's all. I mean, all this was not occupied by any other European country. Obviously, it was occupied by Native Americans. So that's where they staked their territory. All right. So how was 1763 a turning point, and why is that particular year so important? So I'm going to stop sharing for just a minute, and I'm going to come up here and I'm going to share my whiteboard with you. Can everybody see the whiteboard? Yes, no? Can you just tell me yes or no?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes.
Yes, ma'am.
No, I appreciate that. So 1763, right? Big important year. I'm going to give you an acronym for this year, and that acronym is PEEP. All right, so whenever you hear 1763, I want you to think PEEP. It's like the cute little marshmallowy Easter thing, right? A PEEP. So PEEP stands for Pontiac's Rebellion. Pontiac's Rebellion is a Native American attack on settlers who flooded into the Ohio River Valley after the French and Indian War, when they had all this land that they thought was theirs and that they could go into. Pontiac's Rebellion is important because Great Britain is going to have to spend money again protecting their colonists, and it's going to really be a factor in raising taxes and telling the colonists, hey, you're going to need to step up here and start contributing to this family, basically, right? Remember, Great Britain is the mother country. Think about the colonies as her little babies, her children, and she's telling them, listen, time to get a job, all right? Time to contribute to society. You want to live in my house rent free, then you need to go out and get a job, This is essentially what's happening here. The E stands for end of the French and Indian War. That's my abbreviation for French and Indian War. Oops, sorry. The second E is the end of salutary neglect. Big concept, big important. Fourth time you've heard me say the word salutary neglect. Salutary neglect was that policy of Great Britain not enforcing anything as long as they were making money. That's going to be over because they're in debt now after the French and Indian War. So they need to make more money. They need to pay off that debt. So they're going to start enforcing policies. They're going to start laying down some taxes. They're going to start passing laws in Parliament that the colonists aren't happy with because they don't feel that they are being represented in Parliament. So end of French and Indian War, end of salutary neglect. And then this is a big one, the Proclamation Line of 1763. When Pontiac's Rebellion happens, the British say, you know what, we're going to fix this. We're not going to have to deal with more Indian attacks because we're just going to tell our colonists that they are not allowed to move west of the Appalachian Mountains. They mark the Appalachian Mountains as the line. All right, they said you are not allowed to move west. Y'all, there is nothing that pisses off an American more than being told what they cannot do. And that is true today, and that is true back then. Nothing else pisses off an American more than being told, you can't do that. You can't go there, right? Or just being told anything, basically. So those 4 events happened in 1763, and they are all indicative of why that year is such an incredible turning point for the relationship between Great Britain and her colonies. So that's definitely something that you want to include, definitely something that you want to have in your notes. All right, I'm going to pop it in the chat for you too. All right, so let's take a look here. Explore that just a bit more, how 1763 was such a big turning point. And it really revolves around the relationship between Great Britain, the mother country, and her American colonists, the little babies over here across the Atlantic Ocean. The colonists, after the French and Indian War, man, we are stoked. We look at this and we're like, look at all this land. It's ours. We can take it, right? We got all this land. Now the French are gone. We kicked them out. Be gone. You are kaput. And the colonists also learned new guerrilla fighting tactics from the Native Americans. So they feel confident in moving out into that territory, in moving into land that is occupied already by a group of people, right? Great Britain, however, little less excited after the French and Indian War. Great Britain is hurting. They are hurting real bad, right? And they're hurting because of this blank check. They have huge war debts that they racked up fighting for the colonists. So they're saying, you know what? I think maybe that you should pay for this. I think that you should be involved in paying off these war debts. And so because of that, more decisions are now going to be made by the British Parliament. Essentially, the way I always think about it is that the colonists danced, right? And now it's time to pay the band. That's what Parliament thinks, right? We fought for you, and now it's time to pay for that, right? Things aren't free, and they're not cheap either. A lot of other problems are going to strain that relationship between Great Britain and the colonists, and everything that I mentioned here really boils down to that acronym of PEEP. Pontiac's Rebellion, for example, new land is going to mean new conflict. We're not going to remove the British Army from America. The Army is actually going to stay here in North America, in these American colonies after the French and Indian War. And that kind of starts to rub people the wrong way, right? Because we're going to be asked to quarter some of these soldiers and the British Army. You have Pontiac's Rebellion, which I can't spend, 5 hours talking about, but I'll give you the rundown of it, which is essentially that colonists are flooding into the Ohio River Valley. Obviously, they're going to run into Native Americans who are, living there already. And Great Britain is going to have to spend more money to defend those colonists on the frontier and defend them against Native Americans like Chief Pontiac. So for Great Britain, their main solution to this is, listen, these colonists are flooding across the Appalachian Mountains. They're running into conflict. What if they just didn't go there, right? What if they just didn't move across the Appalachian Mountains? And so that is their solution, the Proclamation Line of 1763, which is this purple line all down here. And the marcation is the Appalachian Mountains. So Great Britain told her colonists, you are not allowed to move across the Appalachian Mountains. And they are pissed, right? We're angry because we can't gain any more land. We want to gain that land. We're being told what we can't do, which automatically makes us upset. And we're pretty upset because we feel that this is a decision. We're not feel, but it was a decision made in Parliament, and it wasn't made in the colonial assemblies. And we feel that our representation isn't in Parliament. Our representation is in the colonial assemblies, because those are the people the colonists elected. They didn't elect any of these people in Parliament. Not a single colonist is represented by some fancy white man in a stupid wig over in England in Parliament, right? So that end of salutary neglect, which is obvious by passing the proclamation line, that end of salutary neglect brings across a concept of parliamentary sovereignty. And again, this is part of your acronym. The end of salutary neglect begins parliamentary sovereignty, in which Parliament truly believes that they are the ultimate authority on all laws and taxes, and that Great Britain is going to now govern the colonies strictly. Okay? The taxes and laws that affect the colonists are going to be passed without the colonial assemblies. And colonists are going to try as hard as they can to hang on to their power. But this shift right here, this is the road to revolution. We are on the way to revolution right here in 1763. The end of the French and Indian War is the beginning of the American Revolution. Okay? End of French and Indian War equals beginning of American Revolution. A really important aspect to think about and to remember. You know, when you look at salutary neglect, where you have policies but nobody is enforcing them, I think the best analogy is, you know, like dress code. You have a dress code, but you don't enforce it. No one's going to follow it. That's what England did. That's what the colonists did. And then all of a sudden, if you start to enforce it, you're going to get pushback. All right. You're going to get people saying, well, she's wearing this shirt and you didn't dress code her. Why am I getting dress coded? I wasn't told anything about these leggings in first period. Why are you saying something about it now? Y'all, if that doesn't hit home, I don't know what will. Okay. That's the best analogy that you can think of when you think about England and no longer abiding by salutary neglect and rather coming through with parliamentary sovereignty. So what I want to do real quick right now is go over the one thing that you have due today, and then this map that's available. So I posted your Quizlet and your quiz yesterday. They were open since yesterday. You could have worked on it if you wanted to. You didn't have to. It is due today. So please make sure that you take care of that so you don't incur any late penalties. Study the Quizlet, guys, before you do anything else. Okay, study the Quizlet. I promise you that's going to help you. I promise. Okay.
It's gonna help a lot.
Uh-huh. And then the 1754 versus 1763 map. Okay. This isn't due until tomorrow, so you don't have to worry about it. It's just kind of on your radar. You don't have to do anything with it today, however. But what I have for you here is my map, right, that I colored. Look at that beautiful coloring and shading. Impeccable. And I have some questions. So this is the map of 1754. Here are some questions about that. All you have to do is click here and then answer your questions, type them in. Here's the map on 1763, that change, the difference, and then some questions on that. It's just 6 questions total, right? 3 questions for each map. And they're just simple, right? Which nation on the map had the best colonies, do you think? Right? Looking at 1754, and then why? You just answer that. So this is due tomorrow, but it's available for you now.